Hi, this is Christian Cantrell, and this is a presentation I did the other day called Building Your First Chrome Extension, so I just figured I would do a quick recording of it so I could share it with everyone else. It's only about 12 slides long, and then I'll start looking at some code in the context of an extension that I built. And at the end of it, you should know pretty much everything there is to know about Chrome extensions and be ready to start building your own. So I will start off with the obligatory overview here. Chrome extensions obviously extend Chrome's capabilities, as the name implies. So they add functionality beyond what's available in Chrome right out of the box. They are cross-platform, Mac, Windows, and Linux. They are essentially zip files with an extension of CRX, and they contain your HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and your assets, as well as a manifest file. They can also contain some native code as well. You can use native client in Chrome extensions. They have access to all the standard JavaScript APIs that you're accustomed to using, plus additional APIs in the Chrome namespace, and I'll get into details about those in a few slides. And a little known fact, packaged apps and themes are actually implemented as extensions. So what can Chrome extensions do? They can actually do quite a lot, and I'll get into more details when I start showing you some of the unique APIs that extensions have access to. They can add UI to the browser if they want to. They don't necessarily have to, but they typically do. And they typically do so in two different ways. They use either page actions or browser actions. They can't use both. A page action, you'll usually see a little bit of UI added to the location bar or to the right side of the Omnibox here. And if the extension is using browser actions, then you'll see some UI added to the browser itself to the right of the Omnibar. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. Page actions are specific to certain pages. So for instance, when I look up here during this presentation, I have this favorites icon here to bookmark this page. But if I go over to the New York Times and I look up here in the Omnibox, now I see an extension that is relevant to cookies in the context of this page. And I also see this extension here, which allows me to subscribe to the New York Times RSS feed. So that's specific to pages that use RSS. Now here's another extension here. Let me go back here and talk about browser actions. So here's an icon up here that's to the right of the Omnibox. This is my Google Voice extension, and if I click on this, it's going to show me all my text messages that I've gotten recently. So this is relevant no matter where I am. This is just sort of additional functionality added to Chrome as opposed to being specific to a certain page. So what else can extensions do? They can present UI, as we see in this little pop-up here, or as we see in this little pop-up here for this Google URL shortener Chrome extension. They can add items to the context menu, so the right-click menu. They can change the display of the page, and the extension that I'm going to show you in a little while that I wrote changes the layout of pages pretty dramatically. And they can also override default pages, and your default pages or your new tab page like this one, or also your bookmarks page and your history page. So the general architecture of a Chrome extension, we'll start with the manifest file, which is in JSON format. It contains everything you'd expect from a manifest file, such as name, description, version, icons, permissions, etc. And I'll show you an example of that in a few slides. There's typically a background page, which is an invisible page. It has no UI, and it sort of holds the main logic of your extension. There's an options page, and I'll show you an example of that. So if I go over here to my extension manager and look at all the extensions I have installed, I can click on this options link here, and this page allows me to configure certain aspects of the extension. Not all extensions have options pages, but many of them do. Here's another example here. Override pages, again, this is your bookmark manager, your new tab page, or your history manager. They can have pop-ups. So again, here's the example of a pop-up that comes up when I click on this URL shortener. So that's just a page that's contained in the extension package. Content scripts. This is JavaScript that is injected into pages that are loaded into your tabs. So this is JavaScript that's used to interact with pages that you want to manipulate in some way. And you can have just arbitrary pages that you can show with this chrome.tabs.create function or window.open. Here's a quick look at a manifest file. I'm not going to get into too many details here because I'll show it to you in more detail when I actually start reviewing the extension later on in the presentation. But I have, a name version. This is the application version. Then I have the manifest version, and this dictates things like permissions, description, icons, background script, browser action as opposed to page action. Here's my options page, and here are my permissions. Content scripts are a very important part of Chrome extensions. It's how you interact with content that's loaded into the browser. You can either inject JavaScript into pages as strings or as files. So you can just sort of, if you want to do something relatively simple, you can just sort of inject it as a single string. But if you want to do something more complex, obviously it's going to make more sense to manage your code in the context of a file. The JavaScript will execute in the context of that page or in the process of that page as opposed to the process of your extension, which is an important distinction, and I'll explain why. That means that your content scripts can't call functions that are defined by your extension, for example, in your background page. So you actually have to use messages in order for the two processes to communicate, and I'll actually show you an example of that shortly. It's best not to think of your content scripts as part of your extension, but to think of them as part of the content in which they are running, or the content that they're manipulating or interacting with. That way, it's sort of easier to understand this barrier between your extension and the content, since they're running in different processes. Options pages, these are the pages that allow users to configure your extension. In order to specify an options page, you just use this options page property in your manifest file and point to the HTML file that contains your options. You can use local storage to save your options. You can also use this chrome.storage API, which has some distinct advantages. If you use chrome.storage, it supports the storage of actual objects instead of just strings that you have to treat as JSON with stringify and parse. And also the data is synced with Chrome Sync, which is pretty awesome. So if somebody configures your extension on one computer, then that configuration will be synchronized with their other computers as well. So I think that's pretty slick. I'll show you a quick demo. I showed you this earlier, but just to drive the point home a little bit, here is I'll pick this one here. Here's the options page for my URL shortener. You can see that the UI is actually different for each of these options page. The UI is entirely provided by the options page itself. And here's an example of an extension that doesn't have an options page. Override pages. So once again, Chrome extensions can override some of the default pages in Chrome, and those include your bookmark manager, your history manager, and your new tab page, which is the page that comes up when you open a new tab. And they can contain HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Communication in Chrome extensions. There are a few different ways that extensions and various aspects of your extension can communicate with each other. So pages can call functions on each other and manipulate each other's DOMs, so that's pretty straightforward. You can use APIs as getViews or getBackgroundPage API to get references to different pages. So for instance, your background page can just call functions on various views and vice versa using dot notation in a very straightforward way. They're all running the same process, so they can call functions on each other very easily. But content scripts are a little bit different. Content scripts and extensions, they have to communicate through a message API. And I'll show you an example of that shortly when I actually get into some code. But again, your content script, which is your script that gets injected into content, and your extension are running in different processes, so they can't just call functions on each other. Additionally, extensions can actually communicate with each other as long as they know each other's IDs. So you can actually have multiple extensions that collaborate with each other. The Chrome APIs. There are a bunch of different Chrome APIs, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I'm not going to list all of them, but I wanted to point out a few of the Chrome APIs. So there are a whole bunch of different Chrome APIs. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail, or talk about all of them, but I did want to highlight a few of what I consider to be the more interesting ones. There's an alarms API that you can use to have an event fired, which corresponds to certain criteria. So you can specify a certain duration of time or even specify a certain date and then have an event called, which is pretty slick. You can interact with the browser's bookmarks. You can determine if the browser is idle or if the browser goes from being idle to active again. So if nobody interacts with the browser for a certain period of time, then it can be considered idle. And then when they begin interacting with it again, then it goes from idle to active. You can hook into the Omnibox, so you can specify a specific keyword that after the user enters it into the Omnibox, then your extension will start receiving keyboard events with the additional keystrokes, and then you can just react to that however you want, which is pretty slick. There's the storage API, which I talked about earlier. So things stored in the storage API are synchronized across different instances of Chrome. And also you can serialize entire objects as opposed to strings of JSON and using parse and stringify and stuff like that. You can manipulate and open tabs in Windows. There's a text-to-speech API, which is pretty slick, I think. And there's also this web request API, which allows you to intercept, block, modify in-flight requests and analyze responses. So you can imagine building something pretty slick here for debugging or for analytics or something like that. So a quick word on security in Chrome extensions. If you want your extension to be able to do things like interact with the user's bookmarks or read from the clipboard or write to the clipboard or insert items into the context menus or get the user's location, etc., then you have to actually ask permissions, and these permissions are expressed in your manifest.json file. If your permissions don't match a known keyword, then they're assumed to be a pattern matching a host, and that's the host of content that you want to be able to interact with a content script. Also, extensions don't run while your browser's in incognito mode by default. You can opt into having your extensions run in incognito mode if you want to by going to your extension manager and clicking on one of these corresponding checkboxes. It's typically not something that users want, since extensions have the ability to track what you're doing. And usually when you're in incognito mode, that's not something that you want. So something that's not usually done. And finally, just a couple of miscellaneous fun facts about Chrome extensions. First of all, you can use absolute paths if you want to. I don't know why you'd want to, but you can, using this URI scheme here with the extension ID. When you're developing your extension, it actually won't have a permanent ID yet, so you can use this add extension ID token in its place. You can use your debugger and dev tools with your extensions just like you're accustomed to using, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. I talked about this earlier, but again, it's worth repeating that you can register a specific keyword with the Omnibox, and then you start getting keyboard events after that keyword has been entered. And then you can just react to those keystrokes in any way you want, which I think is really slick. And finally, there's a background permission, which allows your extension to essentially always be running. So it makes Chrome start when the user logs in, and it keeps Chrome running even after all the Chrome windows have been closed. So this is a feature that sort of brings Chrome a step closer to an operating system. So if your extension wants to be able to show notifications at any time, then you're going to want to have it running all the time whenever the user is logged in. Okay, enough slides. Let's start looking at some code. So the first thing I'm going to do is walk you through the process of loading an extension that you're working on, and just sort of show you what the workflow looks like. So I'm in my extension manager here, and I'm going to click on this Load Unpacked Extension button. And then you just navigate to the directory containing your extension. And again, this is an extension that we're still developing, so it hasn't been packaged yet. My extension is called Qualify. And if you look up here to the right of the Omnibox, you'll see these three icons. But after I install this extension, you'll see that I now have these four icons here. Qualify is an extension that uses a browser action as opposed to a page action. If it were a page action, then you'd see the icon in the Omnibox here. And let me show you how it works. I'll open up a tab here. And actually, I'm going to change the options first. Okay, they're set properly. So I'm going to open up the CSS regions specification here, which is this really, really long vertically oriented document. And if I want to make it a little bit friendlier for reading, since it's such a long document, I can click on this Qualify extension. And you can see that it's now been laid out in columns, and these columns have been arranged in pages. And I can scroll through these pages using my arrow keys, which is sort of a nicer reading experience. And then if I click on one of these named anchors, then I'll just be forwarded to the page that contains that destination. Here's another example of a story which is sort of ugly to read because the lines are far too wide. The width is just 100%. And if I click on Qualify here, then it's a much nicer reading experience. Also, you can see that the number of columns and the column width changes dynamically as I change the font size, and also if I were to change the window size. Now this extension has some options, so I'm going to go to the options page, and right now the number of columns is being determined algorithmically, so essentially it's choosing the optimal width of a column. But I can override that if I want to by just unchecking this box, and now I'm saying that I want 2 columns, so if I reload this page and click Qualify, then I get 2 columns. Or I can say, actually, I want all 5 columns, reload the page, and now I should see 5 columns. So that's how the options work. Now, let me show you very quickly how you can debug different aspects of your extension. So if I want to debug the content script is being injected into this page. And so if I want to debug it, I can just debug it directly from this page. So I'm going to open up my DevTools, hit Escape to open up my console, and this is some output, some console.log output that's in my content script. If I want to debug my options page, I can just go to my options page, open up my DevTools, and I can debug them this way. Now, I also have a background page, so how do I debug my background page because it doesn't have any UI? That I can actually do from the extension manager. I can just click on this Generate Background Page link here, and it's going to open the DevTools, and I'll hit Escape, and you can see that, that here's my console output. I can also reload my extension from here after I've made changes to it. You can also reload your options just by going to your options page and hitting reload. And obviously your content script can just be reloaded by reloading your content and running it again. So that's what the general workflow looks like. When your extension is finished, you can click this pack extension button and you can actually package it, at which point you can upload it or do whatever you want with it. And you can also disable it and delete it from the extension manager. So that's what the general workflow looks like for building an extension. And now let's check out the code. So let's start off with the manifest file here. We reviewed this briefly when I was showing you some slides, so I'm not going to go over all of it, but this is essentially everything you expect to see in a manifest file. Your name, version number, the version of the manifest file, which sort of dictates what Chrome expects to find. There's a description that will show up in the extension manager and other places here, my icons, various size icons. Now here's my background script. This is the script that's going to run in the background, which is that contains sort of the a lot of the main logic of the extension. There's also the content script, which I'll show you shortly, which contains all of the layout logic. That's a script that gets injected into the various pages that I want to lay out. So here's my browser action property. Again, this is a browser action as opposed to a page action. So the title here is Qualify, and we can see that if I hover over the extension, then you can see the little tooltip pop up and say Qualify. And here's the icon that I want to appear over here in the corner. Here's my options page, and here's my permissions. It's going to run in the background. That's because I have a background script. It needs access to tabs, and since these are not recognized keywords, then these are being interpreted as patterns matching hosts. And essentially what I'm saying here, obviously, is that I want access to the entire internet because any page might be a page that the user wants to reformat. So let's start with the background.js page. And we'll start at the bottom here. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm just adding an event listener to the browser action. And I'm saying when someone clicks on that icon, then call this function called click here. And in this click function, then I'm basically just doing a query for the current tab. There's a little debug output that I showed you earlier. And then I'm injecting some CSS into the page that I want to manipulate. And I'm injecting some JavaScript as well. So I have this spinner.js, and that's the little animation that shows while the layout is being calculated. And then script.js, this is my content script, which has the logic to actually build the columns in the pages. Here's my options page. It's actually in two parts. Here's the HTML for it, and here's the JavaScript behind it. And finally, here's my content script. This is the script that actually does all the layout. So that's essentially all the different parts of the extension. But there's one really important piece here that I want to point out, and that is how the content script gets access to the options. So the options are specified by the user, and they are stored sort of in the context of the extension as opposed to the content that's being manipulated. In other words, if I go to the CSS region spec and I want to change the format of it and I want to know how many columns the user has requested, that content script is running in the context of the region's specification, right, as opposed to the context of my extension. So how does it get that information? It doesn't have access to that information. So the way it has to access that data is by communicating with the extension. It does that through messages. So in my background page here, I have this piece of code here which is sort of setting up that, that message relationship. And so I have this event listener, which is basically saying that when there is a request made for preferences, then grab preferences out of local storage. So I'm using local storage as opposed to using the Chrome storage extension here. And then just send this response. So basically it's just sort of sitting here, my background page is just sitting here waiting for someone to request preferences. Now here's my content script. Remember, this is being injected into the content that I want to change the format of. And in its init function here, the last thing that it does is it sends this message using this API here, the Chrome extension send message. And it sends this object with this sort of arbitrary property called action, and the action is prefs. And there's also this function here which represents the response. And when this function is called, then I can assume that the response is my preferences. So essentially what happens is this init function gets called after the content script is injected. I send a message to whoever's listening for that message saying that I need to know the user's preferences. And when I get a response, then I assume that that this prefs.column number is corresponds to the number of columns that the user has requested. And then over here in my background page, it's just sitting here waiting for that request. And it has access to the local storage and the preferences, so it just sends that response back to the content script, and then the content script is able to do what the user requests. So that's pretty much all there is to this extension. It's relatively easy. The messaging may be a little bit confusing at first, but if you think of your content script as part of the content that you're trying to manipulate as opposed to part of your extension, then it starts making a lot more sense. Otherwise, these extensions are very straightforward, very easy to write, and very powerful. I have a whole bunch of ideas for additional extensions that I want to write, so I'll be releasing them shortly. I'll be releasing this one as well as soon as it's finished. It's not really finished yet. It's still, I still want to add a whole bunch of different features to it. One of the features specifically I want to add to it, and this is a question I got during my initial presentation, is why is Callify implemented as a browser action as opposed to a page action? And that's actually a really good question. I think ultimately I want this to be a page action because it's not going to be relevant on every page that you're on. For instance, if you're using Gmail or something like that, you can't qualify your Gmail, right? You can't click on this and expect anything sane to happen. your Gmail is not going to be divided up into columns or something like that. So what I need is some kind of heuristic to look at the content and determine whether it can be reformatted into columns effectively or not. And if it can, then I'll show the Qualify icon in the Omnibox here. So it'll become a page action as opposed to a browser action. When it's finished, I'll release it and I'll open source it so you can check out the code. And I hope you learned something about Chrome extensions. Thanks for watching.